There is a version of this story where the kiss was a mistake, where she was frightened or confused or acting from some impulse she could not fully account for, and he was simply the person who happened to be there. Where the whole thing could be explained, revised, apologized for, folded away into the category of things that happen and are never mentioned again. That is not this story. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had thought about it for 3 weeks. She had decided. And then she had done it, standing in the study of the man who had never once, in 37 years, been kissed by anyone, in a house full of people who would have told her it was the worst decision she had ever made. She thought it was the best decision she had ever made. She was right. It took him 8 months to understand that she was right. Subscribe and hit the bell right now if you are new here. You will not want to miss where this one goes. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Now, her name was Shun Adeyemi. She was 29 years old. She had been working in the Kang household for 5 months when it happened. Before those 5 months, there was the rest of her life. Shun Adeyemi had grown up in Lagos in a house that smelled like cut fabric and chalk dust. Her mother's tailoring in the front room, her father's mathematics in the study. The two trades coexisting in a house that had taught her, without meaning to, that the most precise way to understand the world was also the most beautiful. Her father drew geometric proofs the way other people drew pictures. Her mother cut patterns by eye without measuring, because after 20 years her eye was more accurate than any measure. She had inherited both, the geometry and the feel of things. She had studied architecture in Lagos, then a postgraduate year in London, then Seoul because her thesis supervisor had said. With the particular conviction of someone who knew what they were talking about, the tension between traditional structure and contemporary space is most alive right now in Korea. Go to Seoul. Look at how they are solving it. She had gone to Seoul. She had looked at how they were solving it. She had stayed because the city was the most interesting city she had ever been in, which was saying something. Because she had been in several interesting cities, Seoul had a quality she could not fully name. Something about the way the old and the very new occupied the same streets without resolving, without either winning. She found that more interesting than cities that had settled into one or the other. She had worked for an architecture firm for 2 years. Good work, real work. She had been good at it. And then the firm had gone through a restructuring, not her fault, nothing to do with her performance, simply the way things go, and she had found herself with time and with a decision to make. She could find another firm. She could do that easily. She had credentials and references and a portfolio of work she was proud of, but she found, in the months after the restructuring, that she was not sure she wanted another firm. Not yet. She had been in the particular intensity of professional architecture for 4 years, and she wanted to think. She wanted to do something with her hands that was not drawing. She wanted a different pace. For a while she worked out what the next version of herself was supposed to look like. Household work had come through a contact. A woman she had met at a language exchange class who managed domestic placements and had said, in the direct way of someone stating a fact, the work is precise and satisfying, and the good households pay well and leave you time to think. Soon had looked at her carefully. She had said, "Tell me more." 3 weeks later, she had her first placement. She had discovered that the woman was right about all of it. The work was precise. The satisfying was real. There was a specific pleasure in a house running well, a pleasure she recognized from her mother's workroom, from the feeling of a pattern cut correctly and a seam that lay flat. She had worked her first 2 households with the full attention she brought to everything and had learned the vocabulary of the work, and had found, by the end of the second placement, that she was not ready to stop. The Kang household had been the third. 5 months of early mornings and late nights. 5 months of learning the specific geography of a large house, which doors stuck, which floors announced themselves, which rooms needed airing and in what order. She had worked in 2 households before this one. She understood the geometry of the work. She understood the invisible architecture of large houses and the people who move through them. And she had learned, across 2 years of this, that the quality of a household told you everything you needed to know about the person at the center of it. The Kang household told her he was precise, ordered, consistent to a degree that went beyond preference into something closer to principle. Things were done correctly or not at all. Standards were maintained not because anyone was watching, but because the standards were the standard. She had walked in on the first Monday and understood within an hour that whoever ran this house had a specific quality of mind and had arranged accordingly. She respected that. She had something of the same quality herself. Kong Jiho was 37. He was the kind of man who fills a doorway without blocking it, not physically imposing, something else, a quality of presence that meant the room reorganized around him without anyone deciding to reorganize. He ran the family's business interests with the precision of someone who had spent his entire adult life building something and had never once allowed himself to be distracted from it. The household staff knew one particular thing about him. Everybody in that household knew it, not because it was spoken about. It was not spoken about, not directly, not with names or details. It was known the way things are known in close quarters, from accumulated observation, from the texture of his daily life, from 20 small pieces of evidence that combined into a single clear picture. He had never been in a relationship. Not a short one. Not a private one nobody knew about. Not a convenient arrangement or quiet understanding. Nothing. He had spent 37 years in a world where the expectation for men of his position was specific. Alliances, arrangements, the particular social architecture of families with power. And he had met every expectation except that one. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. He did not explain. Soon had been in the house for 2 weeks when she stopped not thinking about it. She had noticed before then, you notice everything in a house like that, because noticing is the work, but she had filed it in the category of things that were not her concern and kept moving. And then one evening she had been in the corridor outside the study, restoring a framed photograph to its position after dusting, and she had looked through the open door and seen him at his desk. He was reading something. He was completely still. He had the look of a man who had spent so long in his own company that his own company had become the entirety of his interior world. Not lonely, not unhappy, but sealed, enclosed, a life that had been made very full of everything except the one kind of fullness that requires another person. She had looked at that, and she had felt something that she would later describe to herself as being moved. Not romantically, not yet. Something more fundamental. The way you are moved by a piece of music that is technically perfect and emotionally empty, by someone who has learned every note and forgotten, or never known, that the notes are supposed to do something. She had gone back to work. She had kept going back to work. She had kept noticing. She was a person who noticed things and then thought about what she had noticed, and over the following weeks she had thought about this the way she thought about things she had not yet decided what to do with. The household was run by a woman named Manager O. Manager O was 56. Efficient to the point of being remarkable, and operated with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had managed this house for 12 years and believed in 2 things: the work done correctly and the staff understanding exactly where they stood. Where Soon stood was third. Third in the staff hierarchy, which meant she handled the rooms on the upper floor, and the 2 guest suites, and the study. And she did not interact with Ken Jiho unless the interaction was strictly necessary for the work. She had not interacted with him more than 4 times in 5 months. The first time, he had come into the study when she was cleaning and said, without looking up from his phone, "The left window needs resealing. There is a draft." She had said yes and arranged it. The second time, she had been in the corridor, and he had come out of the study and nearly walked into her. She had stopped to check a mark on the baseboard. He stepped back. He said, "Excuse me," in the tone of someone who means it, and keeps moving. The third time, she had knocked on the study door to deliver a package that had come while he was in. He had answered, taken the package, and said thank you in the same tone. The fourth time was the evening she had seen him through the open door and felt something that required her to think more carefully than she usually needed to about how she understood things. She was in the study a week after that, on a Friday afternoon. He was not supposed to be home. He came in while she was at the bookcase, returning volumes she had dusted to their positions, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her and said, "I didn't know you'd be in here." She said, "I can come back." He said, "No, go ahead." He went to the desk. She went to the bookcase. For a while they were in the same room, and she was aware of him with the specific awareness of a person who has been thinking about another person for 3 weeks and then finds themselves within 15 feet of them. She said, without planning it, "Can I ask you something?" He looked up. She said, "The photograph on the left wall. The one with the coast. Where is it?" A pause. He looked at the photograph. Something moved in his face, not quite surprise. Something more like the look of a man who was not accustomed to being asked questions about himself. He said, "The South Coast, near Tongyong. My grandmother was from there." She said, "It's beautiful." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you go back?" He said, "Not often. There's rarely time." She said, "That's too bad." He looked at her. She had turned back to the bookcase. She was not looking at him. She was returning volumes, checking spines, the ordinary work of the afternoon. He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Soon." He said, "Soon." She said, "Yes." He said nothing further. He went back to his work. She finished the bookcase. She went to the next room. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the week. Not the content, the quality. The specific quality of a man who had been asked a question about himself and had answered it with the care of someone unaccustomed to being asked. Who had said the South Coast near Tongyong with the particular weight of a person saying something real about where they came from. Who had asked her name as though the asking was not casual. She thought about that. Here is what you need to understand about the 3 weeks between that conversation and the kiss. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no incident, no crisis, no moment of high emotion that could be pointed to as the cause. What happened was quieter than that, and more real. She continued her work. She was in the study on Tuesdays and Fridays. He was sometimes there. When he was there, they existed in the same room, and occasionally said things to each other. Small things. Specific things. The kind of things that people say when they are not yet saying what they mean, but are practicing the register. She learned that he took his coffee without anything, that he preferred the east window in the morning and the west in the afternoon, that he had a habit of pressing his thumb against the spine of a book before opening it. A habit he was entirely unaware of. He learned from her things she did not know she was showing him. She did not know yet what he had learned. She found out later. Manager O noticed. Manager O noticed everything. She said nothing directly. She rearranged the Tuesday schedule so that Soon's study work was earlier, when he was less likely to be present. Soon had looked at the new schedule and understood what it was, and said nothing. She rearranged herself back to the original time on the following Friday. She did this quietly, without drama, by simply continuing as she had been continuing. Manager O looked at her with the expression of a woman deciding whether something required intervention. She had decided it did not yet. Yet, the third week. A Friday afternoon, later than usual. She had been delayed by something on the lower floor, a broken cabinet hinge that needed immediate attention and had taken longer than expected. She went to the study at 5 instead of 3. She knocked. No answer. She went in. He was not at the desk. He was at the window, the west one, which she had known he preferred in the afternoon, standing with his back to the door, looking at the garden. She said, "I can come back." He said, without turning no. "Go ahead." She went to the bookcase. She began the work. The room was quiet in the specific way it was quiet when he was in it, not empty, inhabited, the kind of quiet that has a person in it. She did not know, later, exactly how to account for what happened next. She had told herself for weeks that it was not something she was going to do. She had told herself that with clarity and conviction. She was not a person who acted without thinking. She was not a person who made impulsive decisions with significant consequences. She was a person who had thought about this for 3 weeks and had arrived, somewhere in the third week, at a conclusion she had not quite admitted to herself until this moment. She put down what she was holding. She walked across the room. He heard her and turned, and for 1 second they were face to face at a distance of 18 inches, and she could see that he was surprised, not alarmed, surprised. The face of a man whose internal world has just been entered by something unexpected. She stood on the balls of her feet. She kissed him. Not long. Not demanding. A real kiss, present, specific, aware of itself. The kiss of a person who has made a decision. He did not move. She stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said nothing. She said, "I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks." He said nothing. She said, "I'll finish the bookcase." She went back to the bookcase. Her hands were steady. She was surprised that her hands were steady, but they were. She picked up where she had left off. She could feel him looking at her. She did not turn around. After a moment, she heard him move. He went back to the window. She finished the work. She left the room. She did not look at him when she left. In the corridor, she stood very still for a moment. She had expected to feel something after doing the thing, relief, or fear, or embarrassment, or the particular hollow feeling of a decision made and already regretted. She felt none of those things. She felt clear. She felt as though something that had been building a question had finally been given an answer. And the answer was yes, and now they would see what came from that. She went back to work. What she did not know was what happened in the study after she left. He stood at the window for a long time. He did not move. He pressed his thumb against the spine of the book that was on the desk, the gesture he did not know he had, the one she had learned, and he stood there. He had never been kissed before. This was the truth that the household knew without knowing the details of. He had spent 37 years in a world that required a great deal of him: precision, control, the management of things that could not be allowed to be uncertain, and he had managed it by becoming the most certain person in any room. He had made himself into something dependable, something that did not waver. He had made himself into something that had not allowed anyone close enough to waver him. She had gotten close enough. He stood at the window and pressed his thumb against the spine of the book. He thought about the coast near Tongyeong, about the way she had said that's too bad with the warmth of someone who meant it, about the way she had kissed him, the calm certainty of a person who had made a real decision and was standing behind it. He thought about those things for a long time. Manager O came to find him at 6:30. She knocked, entered, and immediately assessed the room in the way that Manager O assessed all rooms, quickly, accurately, with the particular attention of a woman who had been in this house for 12 years and knew every register it operated in. She said, "Will you need dinner?" He said yes. She looked at him. She said, "Is everything all right?" He said yes. She said, "Very well," and left. She went directly to Soon's room. She knocked. Soon opened the door. Manager O said, "What have you done?" Soon said, "I'm not sure what you mean." Manager O said, "Yes, you are." A pause. Soon said, "I made a decision." Manager O said, "You made a very significant error in judgment." Soon said, "I don't think so." Manager O looked at her with the expression of a woman who has managed a household through many things and is now managing through a new category of thing. She said, "Do you understand who he is?" Soon said, "Yes." Manager O said, "Do you understand what this household is?" Soon said, "Yes." Manager O said, "And you still?" Soon said, "Yes." Manager O stood in the doorway. She looked at Soon with the look of a woman reassessing something. She said, "This will not go smoothly." Soon said, "I know." Manager O said, "You will need to be certain." Soon said, "I am." Manager O left without saying anything further. Soon closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She was certain. She was entirely certain. She had been uncertain about many things in her 29 years, and she had learned the difference between uncertainty that required more information and uncertainty that would simply not resolve no matter how much information you gathered. And this was neither of those. This was a clear thing. She had made a clear decision. She would live with it. She went to sleep. The next morning was Saturday. She had duties on Saturday mornings, the upper floor, the guest suites, a particular inventory that happened monthly. She did them. She moved through the house with the same quality of attention she always brought, which was complete and specific and did not flinch. She passed the study. The door was closed. She continued. At 11 she was in the linen room, and Manager O came in and closed the door behind her and said, "How are you?" Soon said, "Fine." Manager O said, "Be honest." Soon looked at her. Manager O had the face of a woman who had asked the question because she wanted the real answer, not the managed one. Soon said, "I'm steady. I don't regret it, but I am aware that I've done something that might not resolve the way I'd want it to resolve, and I'm sitting with that." Manager O said, "Sitting with it." Soon said, "I can't make it faster, so I'm being patient." Manager O said, "Patience is not what most 29-year-olds have." Soon said, "I didn't have it either, until I needed it." Manager O was quiet for a moment. She looked around the linen room, the ordered shelves, the inventory that Soon had laid out on the table for checking. She said, "You reorganized the linen system in your first week here." Soon said, "The old system worked, but it wasn't the most efficient," Manager O said. "I know. I installed the old system 11 years ago. It was the right system for 11 years ago. It needed updating." Soon said nothing. Manager O said, "I didn't ask you to update it. You assessed it, and you updated it, and the house has run better since." Soon said, "That's the work." Manager O said, "Yes, that's the work." She paused. "And what you did on Friday is also you." Both of those things are true. She left the linen room. Soon stood with the inventory for a moment. Then, she kept working. He did not speak to her for 4 days. Not with hostility. He did not look through her. He did not pretend she was not there. When they were in the same space, he acknowledged her presence with the slight adjustment of a person who is aware of someone and is choosing to maintain a specific distance while he worked something out. Not with hostility. He did not look through her. He did not pretend she was not there. When they were in the same space, he acknowledged her presence with the slight adjustment of a person who is aware of someone and is choosing to maintain a specific distance while he worked something out. She understood that. She gave him the distance. She continued her work with the same quality she always brought to it. Complete, precise, without drama. She did not hover. She did not perform the having done what she had done. She simply worked. Manager O watched both of them with the focused attention of a woman running a crisis simulation. On the 5th day, he knocked on the door of the room she was working in. She looked up. He stood in the doorway. He said, "I'd like to speak with you. When you have a moment." She said, "I have a moment now." He came in. He closed the door. He said, "I've been thinking about Friday." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to know what you were thinking." She said, "I told you on Friday." He said, "You said you'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I want to know what you were thinking about." She looked at him. She decided to be entirely honest. She said, "You. The photograph of the coast. The way you said your grandmother was from there. The way you hold a book before you open it. The way the room is when you're in it, which is different from the way it is when you're not. The fact that you asked my name on a Friday afternoon as though it was important information." He was very quiet. She said, "I was thinking that you are a person who has made yourself very complete and very capable and very alone, and that I had opinions about that." He said, "Opinions?" She said, "I thought it was a waste." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "I don't know how to do this." She said, "I know." He said, "I've never." She said, "I know that." He said, "Then you understand that I am not in a position to." She said, "I'm not asking you to be in any position. I kissed you because I wanted to. That's all it was. What happens after is what happens after." He said, "And if nothing happens after?" She said, "Then nothing happens after. I'll keep doing my job." He said, "And you'll be all right with that?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "No, but I'll manage it." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face that she had not seen before. Not the composed certainty of the man she had watched through an open door. Something underneath that. He said, "I need time." She said, "Take it." He left. She went back to work. You know what the waiting felt like. You have waited for someone to work something out. You have sat with the knowledge that you have done something true, and now the truth is in someone else's hands, and all you can do is continue to exist with the same quality you existed with before you gave it away. You know that it is the hardest kind of waiting, because you cannot make it go faster. You cannot argue it faster. You can only be exactly who you are, every day, and trust that who you are is enough. She was exactly who she was, every day. That is the discipline that looks effortless from the outside and is not effortless from the inside. You know this. You have been the one waiting and continuing, doing the work while the answer forms in someone else. You know that the work is the only real anchor in that kind of waiting. She worked. 3 weeks passed. Then, a month. The house continued. She worked. he worked. They were in the same space sometimes. When they were, there was something in the quality of the air between them, not tension, something more like attention, the specific awareness of two people who have both understood something and are waiting for the right moment to say it. The moment came on a Sunday morning. She was in the garden. Not working, she rarely had garden duties. That was Tanaka's domain. But it was early, and the morning was cold and clear, and she had taken her coffee outside because the kitchen had felt small. She was on the bench near the stone wall, the one that caught the low winter sun. He came out. He had coffee. He sat on the other end of the bench. Not close, not far. They sat like that for a while. He said, "I went to Tongyong." She looked at him. He said, "Last week. I hadn't been in 4 years. I took 2 days." She said, "How was it?" He said, "It was the same. The coast looks the same. My grandmother's house is still there. Someone else lives in it now." She said, "Did you go inside?" He said, "They let me walk through. The new family. They were kind about it." She said, "That's good." He said, "Yes." A pause. The morning was very still. He said, "I thought about what you said, that it was a waste." She said nothing. He said, "I think you were right." She held that carefully. She did not rush toward it. He said, "I don't know how to start something. I don't know the first thing about how this goes." She said, "I know." He said, "You seem very certain." She said, "I am certain about what I feel. I'm not certain about how it goes either." He said, "Then we're both uncertain." She said, "Yes, but I think two uncertain people going in the same direction is different from one uncertain person going alone." He was quiet. He looked at the garden. He said, "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Not here. Somewhere else." She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." He went back inside. She sat on the bench for a moment with her coffee, which had gone cold. She was smiling. She had not expected to be smiling. She had expected to feel the careful steadiness she had been carrying for weeks. She felt that, and something else. Something lighter. Something that had been waiting to be released. She went inside. She paused in the doorway for a moment before she was fully through it. She looked back at the garden, at the bench, at the stone wall, at the low winter morning sun on the frost still on the grass. She had sat on that bench one Sunday morning with cold coffee and a clear feeling of something. She had been right about the feeling. She had not known yet what it was going to become. But she had been right about it. You are right about things more often than you give yourself credit for. The question is whether you act on what you know. She had acted. It had taken 3 weeks and a Friday afternoon and a decision made with steady hands. She went fully inside. Manager O was in the kitchen. She looked at Soon. She read Soon's face with the accuracy of a woman who had been reading faces for 56 years. She said, "Dinner tonight." Soon said, "Yes." Manager O was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Wear the blue." Soon had not mentioned that she owned a blue dress. She said, "How do you?" Manager O said, "I manage this household. I manage all of it. Go to work." Soon went to work. The dinner was in a small restaurant that he chose carefully, not large, not the kind of place that drew attention. A room with good lighting and good food and tables far enough apart that conversations were private. He was there before her. He stood when she arrived and looked at her with an expression she catalogued for keeping. They ate. They talked. They talked the way two people talk when they have been in close proximity for months and have formed an understanding of each other from a distance. Now they were speaking directly. The ease of people who already know certain things. the careful attention of people who are learning others. He told her about his grandmother, the woman in the photograph, the house on the coast, the specific quality of her intelligence that had shaped him in ways he had spent 30 years working out the full extent of. She told him about Lagos, where she had grown up, where her mother had run a tailoring business out of the front room, and her father had been a mathematics teacher who believed that all things, properly understood, were patterns. She told him about Seoul, where she had come for graduate school and had stayed because the city suited her in ways she had not expected. He said, "What did you study?" She said, "Architecture." He said, "And you work in a household?" She said, "I'm between things. I wanted time to think." He said, "Between what and what?" She said, "Between what I was doing and what I'm going to do. I haven't fully worked that out yet." He said, "And while you work it out." She said, "I do good work. I do it well. That's enough for now." He looked at her, something in his face, that movement she had started to recognize. He said, "You're going to leave." She said, "I don't know. That's the honest answer." He said, "But possibly." She said, "Anything is possibly." He said, "Yes." He held her gaze. She held it back. The restaurant hummed quietly around them. He said, "I'd like to see you not go." She said, "That's a good thing to know." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'd like to see what happens if I stay." He said, "Then stay." She said, "Not because you asked." He said, "No." "Because you want to." She said, "Yes." That was the dinner. That was the beginning of the real thing, the part that had weight and dailiness and the specific texture of two people building something together with appropriate uncertainty and appropriate intention. The household adjusted around them with the particular efficiency of a household that is managed by someone like Manager O, which is to say, it adjusted completely and without anyone appearing to have adjusted anything. The staff knew. Of course the staff knew. The staff always knows. They knew before Manager O confirmed it, which she did, to each of them, individually, briefly, in the tone that meant, "This is how things are, and you will conduct yourselves accordingly." The things that needed to be difficult were difficult. His family had opinions. Not all of the family. He had a younger sister named Ji-yeon. Ji-yeon had said, when she met Soon for the first time, over tea that Soon had made, that she had been waiting for someone to knock her brother out of his own head. She was glad it had happened before she was too old to enjoy it. Ji-yeon was 32 and had her brother's precision and none of his composure, and was, Soon understood immediately, someone to be liked. But Ji-yeon was not the family opinion. The family opinion lived in two uncles and a cousin. They had particular ideas about what Ji-ho's marriage should look like, about the connections it should consolidate, the alliances it should strengthen, the specific social architecture of two families becoming one, in ways that were legible to the world they operated in. Soon did not provide those things. She was an architect from Lagos who was taking time between jobs. She was not a family with connections. She was not a strategic asset. She was a woman who had kissed their nephew in his own study. There was a dinner in the spring. Ji-ho had arranged it, he had said. "The week before, there's a dinner. My uncles will be there. I want you to come." She had said, "As what?" He had said, "As yourself." She had recognized that answer from the inside. The dinner was large. The table was long. She sat near the middle between Ji-yeon and a cousin she had not met, and she ate well and spoke when she was spoken to, and did not perform anything. She was simply there, fully as herself. The first uncle, Ji-ho's father's older brother, a man named Kang Seo-jun, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms paying attention when he spoke, said, across the table, and not quietly, that he understood she worked in household management. She said, "I do." He said, "And before that?" She said, "Architecture." "I studied and practiced for 4 years. I'm taking some time to think about the next stage." He said, "In Korea." She said, "I came for graduate study and stayed. I find Seoul very interesting." He said, "Interesting." She said, "Architecturally, yes, but more broadly as well." He said, "And you intend to practice architecture again?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" She said, "I don't know yet. That's what the thinking is for." He held her gaze. She held his back. He said, "You're very direct." She said, "I find it saves time." Something moved in his face. Not warmth, not yet. Something more like the recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting to find something simpler than what he was finding. He said, "Jiho tells me you're from Lagos." She said, "I grew up there, yes." He said, "Your family?" She said, "My mother is a tailor. My father was a mathematics teacher. He died 6 years ago." A pause. The table had gone partly quiet, in the way a table goes quiet when a conversation is being attended to. He said, "I'm sorry for your loss." She said, "Thank you." He said nothing further for a moment. Then, he said, "The architecture, what draws you to it?" She said, "The same thing that draws me to most things. The question of how a space can be arranged to support the people inside it. How structure and openness work together. How you can build something that makes people more fully themselves." He looked at her. She said, "I think about that in houses too. Not just buildings." He was quiet. His family was a specific kind of family, with a specific kind of history, and the opinion that Kong Ji-ho's domestic arrangements were a family matter, not a personal one. There were more conversations. There were more gatherings. She understood the assessment each time, and she met it the way she met all assessments, directly, without performance, with the quality of a person who knows their own worth and does not need to demonstrate it, but is also not going to pretend to be less than she is. It took 3 months. At the end of 3 months, Kang Seojun said to Jiho, in a private conversation that Jiho reported to Soon with the careful precision of a man reporting accurately, "She is not what I expected. I have changed my position," Jiho had said. "I know she isn't." Soon had said, when he told her, changed it to what? Jiho had said, to yes. His grandmother's sister was 81 years old and had been living in Busan for 40 years and was the person whose opinion, in that family, carried the most weight in the oldest and most absolute sense. She came to Seoul in the spring to meet Soon. She sat across from Soon in the main room and looked at her for a long time without speaking. Soon sat with the looking. She did not fill the silence. She had learned, early, that silences like this one were not fulfilling. The old woman said, "You kissed him first." Soon said, "Yes." The old woman said, "Why?" Soon said, "Because I saw something that needed doing, and I did it." The old woman was quiet, Soon said, "And because I was certain." The old woman said, "Of what?" Soon said, "Of him." The old woman looked at her for another long moment. She said, "He has never been certain of himself. In that way, it scared him." Soon said, "I know. That's what I saw." The old woman said, "And you kissed him anyway." Soon said, "Someone had to." The old woman made a sound. It was. Shun understood. A laugh, short, dry, the laugh of a woman who has seen many things and has found, in her 81 years, that the accurate description of the world is sometimes exactly that simple. She said, "Someone had to." She looked at Shun one more time. She said, "You'll do." The engagement was announced in June, not to everyone's satisfaction. Nothing involving that family was ever to everyone's satisfaction. but to the satisfaction of the people whose satisfaction mattered, which had been narrowed, over the preceding months, to a manageable number. The wedding was in September. He had asked her what she wanted, and she had told him. Something real. Not small. Real. She wanted a room full of people who were there because they meant it, not because they were required to be. He had understood immediately, and had built accordingly. 3 days before the wedding, Kang Sojun came to see her. Not at the house. He called and asked if they could meet. And she said yes, and they met at a tea house in the neighborhood. He was precise about the appointment. He arrived on time. He said, "I want to say something before Saturday." She waited. He said, "I came to the first dinner expecting to find someone I could manage. I found someone who didn't need managing. That was not what I prepared for." She said nothing. He said, "I was wrong about several things. I was wrong about what Jiho needed. I was wrong about the form it would take when he found it. I was wrong about you." She said, "You've changed your position." He said, "I told him that." She said, "I know." He told me. He said, "I'm telling you directly." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "You should know, at the wedding I intend to say something. To the room. About being wrong." She looked at him. He said, "He has spent 37 years in a family that expected very specific things from him, and got them and gave him very little in return that was not expectation. I was part of that. I want to correct it." She said, "That's between you and him." He said, "Yes, but it will happen in front of you, and I wanted you to know before it did." She said, "All right." He looked at her for a moment longer. He said, "You know, when I first assessed you at that dinner, I thought you were performing composure." She said, "I know. I could see you thinking it." He said, "And you weren't." She said, "No." He said, "No. You were just composed." She said, "My father used to say that the problem with most people is that they make their equanimity dependent on the situation." He said, "Real equanimity is the kind that doesn't require good conditions to maintain itself." He said, "Your father was right." She said he was right about a lot of things. He nodded. He paid for the tea. He left. At the wedding, during the reception, he stood and said what he had said he would say. He said his nephew had spent 37 years building something excellent and certain. The one thing missing was the thing that cannot be built by one person alone. Shun Adeyemi had seen this from 5 months of household work. She had done something about it. With a directness that he had initially found surprising, that he had come to understand was exactly right. He said, "She saw clearly. She acted. The rest of us should learn from that." He raised a glass. The room raised theirs. Manager O, in the front row, held her glass with the expression of a woman who does not express things she does not need to express, and who was, in this moment, required to express nothing. Jion, 2 seats away, was not required to express nothing, and did not. It was a specific kind of occasion, not large, not with the architecture of a performance. The people present were the people who should be present. The ceremony was correct and warm, and the room had the specific quality of a room that has been filled by people who are genuinely happy to be there. Manager O was in the front row. She had sat down with the expression of a woman who had managed this house for 12 years and had, in some small way she would never say out loud, seen this coming before it had arrived. Soon had worn blue. Not the dress Manager O had mentioned, which had been the right dress for the dinner. A different blue. Chosen for this. For today. For the specific blue of a September morning and a room full of people, and a man at the front of the room who was looking at her with an expression she did not have to catalog. She intended to keep seeing it for the rest of her life. She walked in. He watched her walk. Later, people would remember that he had not tried to compose his expression. He had simply looked at her and let what he felt be visible, which was the thing that the people who knew him found most remarkable. He had spent 37 years being the most composed person in any room. He looked at her, and he did not compose himself. That was the most accurate description of what happened to him. Not the kiss, not the dinner, not the grandmother's sister saying you'll do. The fact that he stopped composing himself. She had done that. She would have told you it was not difficult. She would have told you that a person who has spent their whole life composed is not composed because they choose to be. They are composed because nobody has yet given them a reason not to be. The kiss had been the reason. Not because of what the kiss was, but because of what it said. I see you. I have decided. I am not going to let the distance between us be the last word. He had needed someone to not let the distance be the last word. She had not let it. After the ceremony, after the reception, at the end of the long good day, they were in the garden. The same garden she had sat in on a Sunday morning in winter with cold coffee and a clear feeling of something. The stone wall, the bench. The low morning light was evening light now, different quality, same garden. He said, I've been thinking about something. She said, yes. He said, I want to go back to Tongyong. In the winter. The coast is different in winter. She said, I've never seen the South Coast in winter. He said, come with me. She said, yes. He said, I want to show you where I'm from. She said, I'd like that. He said, I've never shown anyone. She said, I know. He looked at the garden. The evening was settling in, the light going soft at the edges. He said, what made you certain? On that Friday. What made you actually do it? She had thought about this. She had a real answer. She said, you asked my name as though it mattered what my name was. You asked it with the specific attention of a man to whom information is important, and you had decided my name was information worth having. I thought, this person thinks I'm worth knowing, and I decided I thought the same about him. He was quiet. She said, and then I thought about the coast in the photograph and how long it had been since you'd gone back, and I thought, this person has been waiting to be given a reason to go back to the things they love. And I decided to be the reason. He turned and looked at her. She said, was I right? He said, yes. She said, good. They went to Tongyong in December. She had never seen the south coast of Korea in winter, and she was not prepared for it. She had expected cold, which it was. She had not expected the quality of the light, low and silver and specific. A different light than Seoul, older somehow. The light of a coast that has been receiving it for a long time. He drove. They left early in the morning and arrived in the afternoon, and he took her first to the harbor, because the harbor was the thing he had always loved first. She stood at the edge of the harbor and looked at the boats and the water and the low light on the islands in the distance, and she understood immediately why his grandmother had been from here, and what it meant to be from a place that looked like this. There are places in the world that make a permanent mark on the people who grow up in them, places so specific in their light or their sound or their texture that a person carries the place inside them as a kind of permanent coordinate. She had Legos. He had this. He said, the islands. In summer you can take a ferry. She said, what's on them? He said, mostly nothing. That's the point. She said yes. They walked. He showed her the narrow streets of the old town, the kind of streets that had not been rationalized, that had grown according to the logic of people walking between places they needed to be rather than any plan. She knew these streets, architecturally. She had seen their equivalents in Lagos and in Kyoto and in parts of London, and she had always loved them for the same reason. They were made by use rather than design, which gave them a specific kind of truth. He stopped at a gate and a stone wall. He said, "This is it." The house was small. The garden in front had been changed. The new family had planted things that had not been there before, but the house itself was the same as the photograph. She could see the photograph in the real thing, the specific relationship of the windows to the wall, the way the roof sat on it. She said, "It's the same." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do they know we're coming?" He said, "I called ahead." The new family was a couple in their 60s. They had been living in the house for 8 years. They were warm about it. They had been warm about it when he came alone in October, and they were warm now. They offered tea. He and Soon sat in the main room and drank it, and the woman of the house said, "Your grandmother had good taste." "This house is a pleasure," he said. She did. Yes, after the tea she walked through the house with him. Not all of it. She was careful about what she looked at, about which rooms she entered and which she only stood at the door of, because she understood that this was not her history to claim. She was a witness to it. That was the right role. In the small room at the back, the one that had been his grandmother's workroom, he said, where she had done her sewing, he was quiet for a long time. Soon stood beside him and said nothing. She had learned, by now, when silence from her was more useful than words. He said, "She would have liked you." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "She had opinions about directness. She said it was rare and should be rewarded." Soon said, "Your grandmother sounds like my father." He said, "Tell me about him." So she told him, standing in the room where his grandmother had sewn, about her father, the mathematics, the proofs drawn like pictures, the way he had looked at the world as though everything in it was a pattern waiting to be understood. She talked until she ran out of what she had to say, and then she stopped. And he had listened with the complete attention she had learned was simply how he was. Not performing listening, actually listening, the way a person listens when what is being said is going somewhere in them and staying there. She had not had many people in her life who listened that way. She had noticed it in the study from early on, the way he gave whatever was in front of him his entire self. She had thought, seeing it applied to his work, imagine what that feels like pointed at a person. Now she knew. He said, "I would have liked him." She said, "Yes. I think you would have." They left the house and they walked back to the harbor as the last of the light went. She was cold. He put his coat around her shoulders without being asked, and she let him. The garden was quiet. The evening was complete. Some people wait their whole lives for someone to see the distance they've kept and decide not to keep it themselves. Some people spend 37 years building a life that is excellent in every way except the one way that requires another person, because they have not yet found the one person who would look at the distance and decide it was crossable. She had looked at the distance. She had crossed it. That was all it took. That was what it had always taken. Someone who saw clearly and decided the seeing was enough reason to act. Never underestimate the one who decides. If you made it here, drop a comment and tell us the moment that stopped you. And tell us, did you see the ending coming from the beginning? We want to know. Share this tonight with someone who needs to be reminded that the first move is almost always the right move.